plenty of activism in all kinds of areas, and the atmosphere has just changed totally. It's the result, very substantially, of activism by young people. The women's movement really took off with small consciousness-raising groups, small groups of women who discussed with each other the kind of repression that was not even regarded as a repression. It was considered as just the air you breathe. It's not nothing like for my grandmother that she just accepted it. It's no other way to live. But they discussed it. They began to carry out activities to broaden their reach. Ran into plenty of difficulties. You always do. Systems of power and authority don't decide to give up quickly. They have to be confronted and overcome. And over time, this just became a huge mass movement which changed global culture very substantially for half the world's population. That's not a small achievement. There's plenty of distance to go, but the progress is remarkable, just as the progress in South Korea has been remarkable. And there just is no other way to do these things. You have to start where you are. If you're, say, you're trying to organize, suppose you want to bring about a really large-scale social change. The way to start may be to, and sometimes is, to organize to go to a poor community where people feel completely powerless. They can't achieve anything. The power system is just too strong. It's hopeless. But maybe they can be organized to demand that the city put up a traffic light at a street where the children cross to school. I'm taking have a real case in mind. And if they can achieve that, people can come to understand, we can do things if we act together. And then they go on to do something else, larger, more far-reaching, and maybe really improve the schools, and maybe overcome, maybe insist that the factory that's in their community not be moved by the multinational that wants to send it someplace else and say, no, it's ours, we're going to keep it here, we'll take it over. At that point, you're moving towards a real social revolution. And that's the way things happen.
My question is very simple, but I would like to know your opinion. What will be the alternative of neoliberalism in world economy? Because right now, neoliberalism is starting to collapse a little bit.
So we have neoliberalism at its peak, and as it starts to wane, what do you think ideally can replace it? What system would be the most effective?
What system can replace the neoliberal system?
Right.
Well, just ask yourself why Korea developed from 1980 to the present, while Brazil went through 20 years of stagnation. One reason is that Korea never accepted the neoliberal systems until the early 90s, and then it began to suffer from them. Through the 1980s, the big growth period, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, in fact, the China, the East Asian economies simply ignored the advice and demands imposed by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. Treasury, the leading Western powers. They ignored them. They followed a policy of state-guided industrial development, which turned out to be highly successful. Latin America, in contrast, followed the rules rigorously and stagnated and declined. So you know very well what at least one alternative, maybe not the best alternative, later, South Korea did come to accept these rules, and within a few years fell into a terrible financial crisis in 1997-98. then it sort of pulled itself out. So there are plenty of alternatives. It's not necessary to follow these rules. Furthermore, we could move way beyond that to a really functioning democratic society. That means one in which decisions about all issues are in the hands of the people who are subject to those decisions. That means communities, workforces, so on. So, for example, why should an enterprise, say a manufacturing plant, why should it be owned and run by banks and managers in some remote place, or even right on the scene? Why should some be giving orders and others taking them? The workforce themselves and the community in which it exists can, in principle, and I think should, ultimately get to the point where they can take over and run these enterprises democratically for themselves. And the same is true of every other institution that exists. There's a convention and a history that says we have to follow orders given to us from above. There was once a convention, to some extent still is, that said that women have to follow the orders given by males, by the husband or some other male. There were not long ago, and still in much of the world are, systems where slaves have to follow the orders of masters. Over history, these structures of hierarchy and domination have been gradually eroded. By no means far enough, but substantially so. So it's a different world than it was 50 years ago. Korea is dramatically the case. The United States also. And that process, history hasn't ended. This process can go on. Anywhere that you see a structure of authority and domination, whatever it is, whether it's in a family or international affairs or anywhere in between, wherever you find the structure of authority and domination, you should also always be asking, is it legitimate? It isn't self-justifying. It has to justify itself. Can it justify itself? Can the structure of domination justify itself? Whether it's a patriarchal family, a management-run, owner-run enterprise, a world system in which a few great powers determine the rules of together with multinational corporations, determine the rules of the World Trade Organization. Are any of these structures legitimate? Well, they have to prove their legitimacy. They have a burden of proof. And if they can't meet it, which is usually the case, then it's our challenge to dismantle it and move on to a greater degree of freedom and justice. And I suppose that's a process without end. So there's no, you can sketch out what alternatives ought to be, but piece by piece, I think you can see how to approach them with particular kinds of repression, domination, authority, inequality, that just have no justification, and therefore can be and should be dismantled. As in the cases I mentioned, civil minority rights, women's rights, control over one's own work, many other things.
I would like to thank you so much because you bring the revolution in linguistic area. Today, I would like to raise one question. That is, the world is facing with so many challenges. The world is moving only two ways. Some countries want to be more advanced, and advanced countries want to are following the principle to back to nature. Within these two frameworks, the world is suffering from so many challenges. Just you mentioned some of them, like global warming, climate changing, and conflict, terrorism. It is so many, we cannot count now. Some of them, just we raise now the problem between South Korea and North Korea. That may be Palestine and Israel. That may be India and Pakistan and so many parts of the world. To solve those problems, we want to give one modality for the world by through the unification of South Korea and North Korea. So most of the people in the world who are in the leading position, they are trying to solve those problems or those challenges only. They never try to find out the root cause of those problems. That's why they all are failed. This it's my claim. So would you mind providing from your side the root cause of those problems and what should be our roles or the roles of youth? Thank you.
Well, you mentioned a series of very difficult issues, and I don't think there's a single root cause for all of them. They have their own root causes. So take India and Pakistan. That's a very serious conflict. It's come close to nuclear war several times. It may again. Pakistan now has the most rapidly growing nuclear arsenal in the world. Of course, it comes nowhere near India's. India is a much more richer, much more powerful country. And as long as Pakistan tries to match India in military power, it'll collapse as a society. Can't possibly do it. Furthermore, both Pakistan and India are facing huge internal problems of their own. One of the major consequences of global warming, it's predicted, and we begin to see this right now, is that it's creating droughts and deserts in large fertile parts of these countries. Pakistan is suffering from right now from floods in some areas, drought in others, and probably related to climate change. When the Himalayan glaciers proceed to melt further, it will become devastating for all of South Asia. Now, these are very serious problems. Now, can they be resolved? Well, the root causes are complex. They go back into the breakup of India and Pakistan and partition even before that. Right now, the most crucial conflict between India and Pakistan is over Kashmir. Kashmir is the most heavily militarized part of the world. There's plenty of brutality, terror, repression, killings, mass graves have just been found. So one question between India and Pakistan is, can there be a resolution of the problem of Kashmir? Well, there are various proposals. Some of them make good sense and I think could be implemented with international support. There should be, there's never been a referendum as was required by the partition agreement. India refused to allow it. That could take place. There could be local settlements on what's called the line of control, the part that Pakistan controls, the part that India controls. There could be moves towards self-determination, autonomy, interactions between India and Pakistan to try to jointly carry forward these options. Those are all possibilities. Another possibility is to keep building up your